Hi there, welcome back. Mr. Taylor here for our next chapter. Today we're starting the lymphatic and immune system. This is our special COVID 19 or coronavirus edition of the lymphatic and immune system. And so, of course, I had to go out and find only the best memes for all of you to enjoy. So hopefully we have some laughs, and here we go. All right, so overview of the lymphatic and immune system. Basically, these are two systems that work so closely together that we consider them to be one system. So, the lymphatic system is just all of the vessels and organs that are used to drain and filter fluid from your tissues. So, basically, they're going to take interstitial fluid from your tissues and absorb it into some capillaries and then move that through your body, transport it, filter it, and then drain it back into your blood. The other part of it is the immune system. And of course, the immune system is what's going to protect you from pathogens. So, like viruses, bacteria, things like that, that are trying to infect your body. All right. So, when we look at the components of these systems, we'll start off and we'll look at the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system starts off with lymph vessels. And the lymph vessels are very similar to veins. They have valves that allow the fluid inside of them, or lymph, to travel in one direction only. And they're also very thin walled, very similar to veins, because they're not under pressure like your arteries are. The smallest of these vessels are called lymphatic capillaries, also known as terminal lymphatics, and those are found inside of your tissues, just like your regular capillaries are. And basically, these are the most numerous, common, and also the smallest lymphatic vessels. And you find them pretty much in every tissue throughout your body to absorb fluid so fluid doesn't build up. And in your digestive system, inside of your small intestine, there's a special type of lymphatic capillary called a lacteal. And the lacteals are important because they actually absorb fatty acids. You see, when you're doing digestion, your carbohydrates and your proteins can be absorbed into the bloodstream, but fatty acids can't. So they're actually absorbed in with the lymph into this stuff called chyle, which is like this kind of like thick, milky liquid that's really gross. I'm sorry. But anyway, and I think that's where they get the name lacteal because it kind of looks like milk. You're welcome. Anyway, so that milky fluid is transported through the lymphatic system and then into the blood, and then it goes to your liver. So one of the reasons why fats last longer as an energy source is because it takes them longer to get into your bloodstream. So they don't give you instant energy like carbs do. All right, so moving right along, lymphatic capillaries, they're very small. As they progress out of your tissues, they start to combine and form into larger and larger vessels. And we have these things called lymphatic trunks, which are pretty large vessels where a whole bunch of these things come together. The lymphatic trunks carry all of this lymph back towards your torso, back towards your trunk. And eventually, they run into these things called lymphatic ducts that are found up in your thoracic cavity. And this is where the lymphatic system connects to your veins and is able to dump all of this lymph back into the blood flow. So I'm going to move ahead for a second and show you what this looks like. So when we're looking at the lymphatic system, here's our lymph capillaries down in the tissues, and they're picking up all this fluid and transporting it one direction because of these little valves that prevent backflow. We have some lymph nodes along the way, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that are used for filtration. So you can see if we follow all this, we go back up, and so this is flowing back up towards our torso, and eventually we get into these larger trunks, and then we get up here, we have these ducts. They're located right up here by some of your veins. So this is just showing you a little bit close up of those lymphatic capillaries, and you can see how they kind of go in between the cells. And you can actually see they're covered with epithelial cells and have little tiny gaps that allow some of this fluid, this interstitial fluid, to come in and become lymph. When we look at those ducts, what we see is that there's two ducts. There is a thoracic duct, and the thoracic duct covers all this area in yellow on your body. So both legs, your abdomen, your right thorax, and your left thorax, and the left side of the head and the left arm. So everything on the left side of your body and below the diaphragm essentially is all going to be covered by this thoracic duct. And this thoracic duct just comes up and it dumps right into your left subclavian vein, and then that is circulated around through your body as part of your blood. On the right side, we have this right lymphatic duct that goes into the right subclavian vein. And by the way, subclavian literally means like underneath your clavicle, so we're talking about just below your collarbones up here. So this right duct is going to drain everything from the right side of your head, right arm, and right side of your torso. So it covers a much smaller area. Right, so going back to where we were, so those are the lymphatic ducts. And so the right duct does the right side of the body, thoracic duct does the rest of the body. And there's this thing called a cisterna chyli, which is not related to Kylie Jenner in any way, shape, or form. But this is kind of what this blue thing is down here. It's actually a really long cistern or like large area that holds a whole bunch of lymph on its way up into the thoracic duct. All right. And so along the way, along all those lymph vessels on their way to the ducts, are a whole bunch of these bean shaped filters called lymph nodes. And basically, these guys, their job is to filter the lymph as it goes through. We have another organ called the thymus, which is shown in this diagram. And the thymus sits right up on top of your heart. And its job is to train your T cells, which we'll talk about the immune system. I like to think of the thymus as the T cell dojo, like that's where they get trained like on how to fight off pathogens, kind of like, like in a kung fu movie or something. But anyway, the thymus, interestingly enough, that's where we get the T cells name from because they are derived from the thymus. All right, there's the spleen, which is this little guy right over here next to your stomach on the left side of your body. The spleen is a gland, or not a gland, it's an organ that is used to filter your blood. And we'll talk about that in depth a little bit later. We have red bone marrow, of course, which is what's going to produce all the lymphocytes and blood cells in our body. So it's hematopoietic tissue. And then we have these things called lymphoid nodules, which there's a lot of different types of these, but the two main types to really know about are tonsils and these things called Peyer's patches. And basically, if you ever wanted to know what your tonsils do, their job is to detect pathogens that are coming in through your throat. So when you swallow things, when you're breathing, we talked about this in the respiratory system, how all the air goes down through the pharynx, down into the larynx. On its way, it goes past those tonsils. Your food goes past the tonsils. Your saliva goes past the tonsils. And so they basically monitor any sort, like looking for pathogens that are present there and get your body ready to have an immune response right away. The Peyer's patches do the exact same thing in your digestive system. They're like almost like tonsils for your intestines. And so let's say you eat some like very suspicious undercooked meat or something weird like that, or like you find some food in the back of your fridge and decide, hey, why not? And as you're digesting this stuff, as it's going through your intestines, if there's any weirdness going on, the Peyer's patches tell your immune system to get ready to fight. All right, so we covered this, we covered this, and we covered this. So let's go ahead and move on. So we were talking about how you remember back in the blood chapter, we talked about how we have all those stem cells that form the blood. So if you look over here, we have our T and B lymphocytes. We're going to be talking about those a lot. They come from this lymphoid stem cell. There's also something called a natural killer cell we're going to talk about a little bit later. And then we're going to talk about all the other white blood cells and the immune response. So I wanted to mention them. But this is why red bone marrow is included in the lymphatic immune system, because of course the red bone marrow inside of our bones is going to produce all these blood cells. And here is our thymus gland. And you can see the thymus sits like right up here, kind of on top of and in front of your heart. So it's like anterior to the heart. And the thymus is broken up into a whole bunch of different regions. It has these little walls that form trabeculae. It has this cortex. It has a medulla. So it's kind of similar to a lot of how the other organs are. But if you look inside of it, what you see is there's a lot of different immune cells in here. And there's these little thymocytes that are going to form your little T cells. So it's kind of cool. They kind of train these T cells to get ready to go off and fight off infections. Here's what a lymph node looks like on the inside. And if you look at the lymph node, it contains a lot of reticular tissue. That's right. It forms a net to filter. And so we have a whole bunch of afferent lymphatic vessels that are going to send lymph into it. And then we have efferent vessels that are going to lead away. And so basically what we find out is in the middle, we have these little things called germinal centers. And this is where you have T cells and B cells that like germinate or basically cause responses to any sort of infection. So as all that fluid goes through here, it's being filtered, and these guys are in charge of killing off any pathogens or bad stuff that come through. And you can see on this photomicrograph, you can see this little dark germinal center in the middle of that. And here's a illustration showing you how the spleen works. And so the spleen, once again, it's just underneath the diaphragm. It's right next to your stomach and pancreas. And so the spleen is very, very vascular. It actually stores some blood. But one of the things it does is that it has little arterioles that go in and little venules that come out. And the blood has to go through all of this tissue in between those two blood vessels. And when it does that, basically what we have here is we have a whole bunch of reticular tissue that's going to help like filter out any sort of weird cells like parasites or broken red blood cells. But we also find a lot of macrophages that are going to clean up the blood and produce an immune response. So basically, it's filtering your blood, looking for any sort of stuff that doesn't belong in there. All right, and of course, we mentioned the tonsils, so let's take a look at those. So you actually have a few different sets of tonsils. You have a palatine tonsil that's back here on the back of your palate. We also have the lingual tonsil, which is connected to the back of your throat. Here's the palatine tonsils back here that we were just looking at. And if you go up into like the nasopharynx, we have pharyngeal tonsils that they also call adenoids. And so basically, all these tonsils, if you notice where they're located, they kind of form like this ring around like the back of your head. So as air comes in, it's going past your pharyngeal tonsils. As if you breathe through your mouth or if you swallow food, drink water, whatever, it's all going past the tonsils back here in the back of your throat and going down. Now, of course, if tonsils become swollen, that's a bad thing. We don't want that. But normally what's supposed to happen is we have these little crypts. And so little bits of this material falls down to these crypts. And there's a whole bunch of like immune cells out here that are just like looking for, trying to detect any sort of pathogen. And so the idea here is that we're trying to like catch things before it full on gets inside of your body. Now, they can become swollen due to infections because they have inflammatory responses like any other part of your body, and they're exposed to a lot of stuff. But for the most part, you want to have tonsils. They're actually good for you. They're not like a bad thing to have. And here's a Peyer's patch if you want to know what that looks like. This is a cross section of our intestine, and we can see there's these little tiny mini organs inside of these. And these Peyer's patches do the same thing. So as food is going through the lumen or the hollow part of the intestine, these guys are like trying to basically look for any sort of bacteria or viruses that don't belong here in your intestine and start to activate your immune response. All right, so now that we're done talking about the lymphatic system, we're going to talk about the immune system. We're going to start off with what's called non-specific immunity. And a lot of this stuff is really common sense. The first one is that your best barrier, like the best thing that prevents you from getting infection, is the barriers of your body, like your skin. This is why we put band-aids on cuts, because as long as your skin is unbroken, it protects most of your body. In fact, your skin is very like dry. You have oil on it. You have a lot of bacteria, what we call flora, that live on your skin that prevent any of these things from getting in. So as long as your skin's unbroken, it's a great barrier. Same thing with mucosa. Your mucous membranes inside of your nose and your mouth, they're fantastic. They're really good at blocking things from getting in. And so that's the idea. As long as these aren't broken, they should hopefully prevent us from getting any sort of infection. The secretions your body make has a lot to do with this too. And actually, I'm going to move ahead a couple slides here and show you. So this is showing you this innate immunity. So we can see like the skin, we have those nose hairs, of course, we have mucus produced by the mucous membranes, which is one of those secretions. All these are working to prevent you from getting infected. And in fact, if you look like your skin, you have epidermal cells, which are really dry and dead on the outside because they're keratinized. You have those Langerhans cells, if you remember from the skin chapter, that are preventing things from getting inside your body. Your skin also produces all these secretions. So, for example, sweat helps to like clean your skin. Sebaceous glands, that oil, helps to like change the pH and also like wash things away. Your oral cavity, your saliva that you produce, actually helps to keep your mouth healthy by producing this stuff called lysozyme, which is a little antibacterial solution made by your body. Interesting fact is if you have dry mouth all the time, it causes very quick tooth and gum decay because you don't have that lysozyme to keep the bacteria from growing inside your mouth. And that's pretty gross. The stomach, if you ever wondered why your stomach has stomach acid, one of the main reasons is that low pH helps to protect your GI tract. So once again, if you eat something like a little funky that's been sitting out at a party for too long and you think, it's fine, if there is bacteria that's growing on it, the GI tract will use the stomach acid to kill anything that's on it, hopefully before it gets inside of you. By the way, don't test that. Don't go out and just try to eat like shady food, but it does help. just, be careful. The mucosal surfaces. So, like, once again, like once you get inside your nose, for example, you have this mucosal epithelium, and it's going to help protect you as a barrier. And you also have like flora, like you have things that live inside of your GI tract. You have things that live inside of your nose that are like those beneficial bacteria that help you there. Okay, so after your barriers, we have this thing called innate. Oh boy, I can't talk. Innate immunity, and basically, this is stuff that's always on, ready to go against any sort of infection. So it's not specific to anything at all. We have these things that are called phagocytes, which phage means to eat, and so literally these are eating cells, and their job is to eat pathogens. The first one is called a monocyte, and monocytes, if we go back and looked at like our blood chapter, this is one of the cells made from those stem cells in your red bone marrow. Monocytes can turn into one of two different types of cells. One is called a macrophage, which is, of course, a big eater. And those kind of wander around your body and they act as like first responders. They're pretty much attracted to any sort of like damage or infection. And they go in and they just start gobbling up damaged, dead cells. They start gobbling up pathogens. We also have these things called dendritic cells, which is another name for Langerhans cells. And the reason why they're called dendritic cells is because they look like dendrites. They have little cellular appendages that stick out like little trees, and in your skin, they're known as Langerhans cells because that's the name of the guy who discovered them. And basically, these are found in the skin. They're also found in some other places like the mucosa, basically exterior parts of your body where you would be exposed to pathogens. And their job is basically to detect those pathogens and kill them off, and also get your immune system ready to fight them. Great. Another type of cell is called a neutrophil. We talked about this in the blood chapter. These are like your second responders that come in as like the reinforcements to the macrophages if things get serious, and their job is to neutralize any sort of stuff that gets inside of you. So, like if you get a cut and some bacteria gets in, the macrophages will show up. The dendritic cells are already there, so they're like your first line of defense. But then the neutrophils will come in and help back them up and get serious. Another cell that can show up is called a natural killer or an NK cell, which I think is the coolest name of any cell ever. They're my favorite. But basically, these guys show up, and if they discover an infected cell, they're kind of like the third responder, I guess. When they show up, if they find any sort of infected cell, they trigger that cell to go into apoptosis, and they basically make it destroy itself, which is pretty cool. So they basically tell cells, all right, it's time to go, and that's it. So those are kind of like your three main cells that are involved in this innate immunity. We also have this thing called the inflammatory response, which you've all gone through. If you've ever had a wound, you've definitely had this before. So in order to get an inflammatory response, you have to have some sort of tissue injury. And this could be like bruising or a cut or a burn, anything like that. Some sort of damage to your tissue is going to cause your mast cells to kind of like wake up and start producing histamine. They also make prostaglandins and leukotrienes, which we talked about in the endocrine system way back in the day. After it makes all these different chemicals, histamine especially produces this thing called vasodilation, which causes everything to become swollen and red. And if you've ever had a cut or a wound, you know that this happens. And then what happens is that we start to get swelling. So one of the side effects of these drugs or these chemicals that your body makes is your blood vessels become more porous and allow all that plasma to leak out and form interstitial fluid, and it causes this localized edema. So you become red and swollen. And then the last thing they do is they call in phagocytes. So they actually use this thing called chemotaxis, which is a fancy way to say they release chemicals that attract other cells. Particularly leukotrienes act as the main uh, chemotaxic agent here that attract white blood cells into the area. And that's what we see as like pus. So if you've ever had a wound that became pussy, even like acne, like if you have like a whitehead, that's what we're talking about. So going back here, we can see we talked about our defenses already. Our internal defenses, we have those mast cells. We also have basophils, which I forgot to mention, which will cause that inflammatory response. We have those natural killer cells that show up. We have all those phagocytes that show up. And basically, these things all work together to fight things off. Here's that inflammatory response. The mast cells, which are present in your skin, if you remember from back in the skin chapter, when they detect these pathogens or allergens or anything that your body doesn't want, they send out all these chemicals, and those chemicals then go and cause this localized swelling, redness, and attract all these white blood cells out of your bloodstream to come out. And they actually squeeze through the endothelium and start attacking the bacteria and fighting off infection. Well, guess what? I think that's our sign that we need to quit here for a little bit. So go take a break. I definitely need a break here for a minute, and I'll see you back here in part two.